Hey there guys, got a video here for you today on the BSA R12, and in this video we're going to be rebuilding the rifle. Now I've made a few changes here and there within the rifle, so as we get to them I will be pointing them out, but for now we're just going to be starting with the regulator. The only other thing that I'll mention is that all the O-rings in this rifle have been replaced off camera. You can get a full O-ring kit from loads of different places. I know Baglaw and Kirkwood sell one, so the O-ring kits aren't hard to find. With that said, we'll start off on the piston, which is this piece here, and I'll just get you a good look at the Belleville stack. On this rifle there's 8 washers, cupped in pairs in alternating sets. So hopefully you can see that there. The next thing we'll do is just add a small amount of silicone grease to the top and bottom O-rings. Just a small amount will do us, then we can wipe off the excess with our fingers. The next thing I'm going to be doing is adding a small amount of moly powder or dry lube to the Belleville washers themselves. As the name suggests, this stuff is just a dry lubricant, and I like to put it on the Belleville washers as I don't want any oil or grease between the washers themselves. A small amount of oil is fine just to stop the Bellevilles from rusting, but I like to lubricate the washers with just a bit of dry lube. You don't have to use dry lube, it's just something that I've found works quite well for me. The next thing we'll do is put the piston in the base of the body, just making sure that that's nice and seated all the way into the body there. The next thing we can do is take our white sealing disc, this piece here, and get that dropped in over the piston. Make sure that's sitting nice and flat, and then with that done we can install our small adjuster screw, so this piece here. And again, just adding a small amount of silicone grease to the O-ring at the end here. Then we can get that installed into the body. That just screws into position like so. Now in the disassembly video I did mention that you should take the measurement between the distance of the top of the adjuster screw to the top of the body, and we did that using a set of calipers. So what I'm going to do is reset mine to the measurement I measured before I took it apart. And on this particular rifle it was roughly 1/4 millimeters. So as you can see there, I've set it to 1/4 millimeter, so it should be at the same pressure it was when we took it apart. And this is a standard adjuster, so if you needed to up the reg pressure you would need to wind this slightly out, and if you wanted to decrease the reg pressure you would need to wind it slightly in. The last thing we can install is the back cap. Now this is my new one and this is the original one. What I'd done was threaded the middle and then put these 2 holes in so that I could use a set of snap ring pliers to install the cover and remove it as necessary. But the original one looks like that. To remove this, what I needed to do was bang a 4mm Allen key in the hole there and then remove it. But we're going to be putting this one to the side and installing our new one. To do that we're just going to be using a set of snap ring pliers to get that screwed into the base there. With that done, that's pretty much the reg complete. That's all fully rebuilt, so we can put that to one side and start on the valve housing. The next thing we can do is rebuild the valve and regulator housing. To begin with, we'll start on the valve, then move forward. First thing we'll do is take our valve, which is this piece here, and just add a small amount of silicone grease to the O-ring at the front here. This is a non-permanent sealing O-ring, so it only stops air from moving forward into the hammer housing when the rifle is shot. So just a small amount of silicone grease to that, then we can get that dropped into the housing nice and carefully like so. The next thing we'll do is take our valve return spring, drop that over the top there and get that pushed into position. The next thing we can do is install our little cap, which is this piece here, and before this goes in I will mention that I have removed the small valve return spring spacer from the end here. Removing that I just found the rifle to be a little more efficient. But you can leave it installed if you want to. The next thing we can do is get that screwed into the back and get that done up nice and tightly with a 5mm Allen key. The next thing we'll do is install the regulator, and before that goes in I'm just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to these 2 O-rings here. With that done we can get the regulator pushed into this housing here, dropping it into position, then pushing it in nice and carefully. Can be a little stiff, so just be careful as you push it into place, but it should go in there nice and smoothly. With that done, I'm just going to take this piece here and add a small amount of silicone grease to this large O-ring round the back. With that done, we can take our small spacer piece here, get that pushed into position, and all this spacer piece does is stop the regulator from becoming unseated. But with that said, we can get the housing screwed on over the top. Then once it's done up tight enough by hand, we can use a 32mm spanner just to nip it up. Now this piece here doesn't need to be done up super tight. What I like to do is do it up until it stops, then back it off until the flats are aligned with the top and the bottom of the housing. That just ensures that the holes in this piece here are aligned with the holes in the block. With that done, the last thing we can do is install the toast rack, which is this piece here. So to get that into position, we'll just push it behind the bottle housing and then get that secured using this screw here, getting that done up nice and tightly with a 3mm Allen key. If your toast rack isn't lining up correctly, what you need to do is make sure that the bottle housing here is aligned with the two cutouts in the toast rack. So hopefully you can see that there. The main idea of this thing is to stop the bottle housing becoming unscrewed when you install and remove your bottle. With that done, the last thing we can do is get the gauge installed onto the housing. So I'm going to be replacing the original BSA gauge with just a standard wicker one. Both of these gauges here are branded wicker, however this one is a standard gauge with the flats on the side, and this one is the BSA one with this housing and the small flats here. I don't really like this gauge, if I'm honest with you. Having to use a punch to tighten it up just really doesn't sit well with me, so I'm going to be replacing it with a standard gauge. Normally what you would do is get your Doughty washer installed onto the threads of the gauge and get that tightened up onto the rifle. However, doing that you don't really have any adjustment for where the gauge is lined up. To combat that, what we're going to be doing is using an X-ring to allow us to get the gauge exactly where we want it, so it's always aligned with the rifle. To do that, we'll be taking our X-ring, putting a small amount of silicone grease over it, then dropping that into the gauge hole. What we can do then is then use our gauge to screw it into position. And the beauty of these X-rings is that they don't need to be done up tight in order to seal. So as you can see there, we've got the gauge aligned with the rifle, so it should always be up the right way. The last piece we have here, which is this piece here, is just a homemade piece that snaps over the end of the valve, just like so. And this piece here is just another piece I made to improve the efficiency of the rifle. What this little piece does is stop the air from expanding along the bottom of the valve and forces it through the top. On average, this little piece here just gave me an extra 5 or so shots over a fill, so not a fantastic improvement if I'm honest, but every little helps. The next thing we have to do is install the pellet probe and the cocking arm into the side of the block. Now this is a little tricky to show for camera, as you have to get into the bottom of the block here, and it does look a little dark on camera. But in effect what we have to do is install this plastic piece first, then come through and push the pellet probe through the back of it, getting the holes in the two pieces lined up. Then we can install the cocking dog, which is this piece here, into here. So that's what we need to do. It's a little tricky to show, but I'll do my best. The first thing we need to do is take this piece here and add a small amount of moly grease to it. Ordinary lithium grease will also be fine. With that done, we can align the hole with the bottom of the block and the front of the block and get that pushed through the back. Then use something like an Allen key just to nudge it forward. With that done, we can take our pellet probe and get that put in the back, being nice and careful as we do so. Then from the bottom there we can take our pellet probe and push it through the back of the sleeve, and then use something like an Allen key to gently pull the sleeve back, getting the two pieces lined up. So hopefully you can see that there, but the two pieces are lined up, so now we can install our cocking dog, this piece here. Before this goes in, I am going to be adding a very small amount of blue Loctite to the screw threads. just enough to stop the screw from coming loose, and then once that's in place we can get that done up using a 2.5mm Allen key. The last thing we'll do is temporarily install this little pin here, and this will stop the cocking arm from flapping about as we're working on it, so just through the back there. The next thing we can do before we get the hammer installed is install the small grub screw for the return spring on the pellet probe. To do that we're going to be using a 1.5mm Allen key to install the grub screw in the hole at the top here, and we're going to be doing this up until we can just about see the grub screw peeking out through the back of the block there. So hopefully you can see that. We can then pull the cocking arm back and then get the grub screw done up. What we do need to do is make sure the eye in the back of the spring is lined up with the grub screw so that it fishes in nicely. Once the spring's in position we can get the grub screw done up nice and tightly with our 1.5mm Allen key. And then once the spring's installed, the cocking arm is spring loaded, as you can see there. With that done, the next thing we can do is get the hammer installed into the main block. To begin with, what I like to do is install the retention grub screw into the back of the hammer. And then what we're going to be doing is taking our trigger pin there, putting it through the hammer, and then using a 3mm Allen key just to tighten the grub screw up onto it, nice and lightly, then back it off about 1/4 or 1/8 of a turn. This just makes installing the grub screw into the back of the hammer a lot easier, as when this goes into position, it's offset, so the hole in the bottom there isn't aligned with the hole in the back of the hammer, and getting the grub screw in that hole is fairly difficult. So what we can do now is align the two holes like so, then align the hammer with the offset towards the bottom, and push that through the back of the block in this hole here. Pushing it through nice and carefully, then we can use an Allen key or something similar just to make sure the holes are still aligned. What we can do then is get our trigger pin installed, so the cutout at the back here needs to be aligned with the back of the block, and the cutout at the top here needs to be aligned with the top of the block. So I like to get this installed using a small set of pliers, pushing it through. Then we can use something like an Allen key just to push it in place. What we have to do then is come back through and tighten the grub screw that we done up earlier onto the trigger pin. However, we need to align the flat in the trigger pin with the actual grub screw. What I like to do is lightly grip the trigger pin, loosen the grub screw off so that the trigger pin is loose within the housing, then lightly push it up and down until I find the point in which the grub screw does in. At this point we know that the flat is aligned with the grub screw hole, then we can get that done up nice and tightly. Now you do have a little bit of adjustment with this, so what I like to do is push the trigger pin all the way down, then get the grub screw done up nice and tight. I've found that pushing the trigger pin all the way down is the best setting for the trigger. However, it is worth a little bit of experimentation. Up next we can get the hammer spring assembly installed into the back of the rifle and also finish off the cocking arm assembly. To begin with we'll take the safety, which is this piece here, and add that to the back of the block. If we take a look at the safety, it has a red dot in the side there, and that needs to be aligned with the top of the block. We can get that secured using the two securing screws, which are these two M3 countersunk bolts, these two here. So we have one in the bottom, then another in the top through this hole here. So we're going to get those done up nice and tightly with a 2mm Allen key. With that done, the next thing we'll do is finish off the cocking arm assembly. To do that, we're going to be first removing this screw here, and this will allow us to install the back cap for the cocking arm assembly. With that done, we'll move the cocking arm out the way, then from the back install this cap here, so this piece here, just as lining it like so, pushing it into position, then securing it with this piece here. We can then get that done up nice and tightly with a 4mm Allen key. With that done, we can reinstall the small pivot point for the cocking arm. Before that goes in though, we are just going to be adding a small amount of moly grease to the outside of the pin. Just a small amount will do us. Then get the cocking arm lined up with the hole in the side of the block and push the pin into position, getting that done up nice and tightly with a 2.5mm Allen key. And with that done, the final thing we can do is get the hammer spring installed into the rear of the rifle. Now this hammer spring is a little different from the standard one, as I've replaced the standard one with a stiffer, shorter one. This one was purchased from Apex Airguns, and again was one of the little modifications we done to the rifle to improve the shot count. But with that said, we can get that pushed through the back, getting that lined up nicely. Then we can take our hammer spring adjuster, which is this piece here, get that dropped into the back. Now again, this is another piece that I've replaced or re-machined, as the original piece wasn't too great if I'm honest. But this one I can just use a flat bladed screwdriver and nice and easily adjust the power of the rifle. At this stage I'm not going to be installing the safety catch in the back here, as what I'm going to have to do is reset the power of the rifle, so we're going to be leaving this off so I can access the adjuster. Another thing I like to do is just add a small amount of blue Loctite to the back of the hammer spring adjuster, then wind it in a few turns, wind it out a few turns, just to get the Loctite spread evenly around the threads. What this does is stop the hammer spring adjuster from winding out from the vibrations within the block. The next thing we can do is install the trigger into the rifle. To begin with, we'll take our trigger blade and our first sear, which is this one here, and line this hole up with this hole in the back of the block. What we need to do also is align this brass plunger here with the small counter bore in the bottom of the block there, nice and carefully, and then we'll push through the pin. So the pin is any one of these three here. They're all the same size, length and diameter. Getting that pushed through like so, and then make sure that the trigger rotates nicely. The next thing we can do is add the second pin, which is this one here, and this just acts as a stop for the second stage sear. With that done, we can install the second stage sear, and that just lines up with the hole in the front of the block. And again, we need to line this brass bush up with the small counter bore in the front of the block here. Then we can push through the final pin. And then once we're happy, we can get the 3 E-clips installed. I haven't installed the final E-clip at the moment, as I may need to remove the second stage sear, but that's just for some work on this particular rifle. If you wanted to, you could install the final E-clip at this stage. The next thing we can do is install the barrel, and the only thing I'll mention about the barrel is that I'm not going to be replacing or reinstalling the brass transfer bolt sleeve. I've tested the rifle and it works fine without it, so I'm not going to be reinstalling it, although you could install it if you wanted to. With that said, the next thing we can do is just add a small amount of silicone grease to these 2 O-rings here. And then when getting the 2 flats lined up with the top of the block and the 2 grub screws, we can get the barrel pushed into position. The barrel itself should be flush with the block at the front here. And then once we've got that in position, we can do our 2 grub screws up nice and tightly using a 2mm Allen key. With that done, the next thing we can do is get the front block installed onto the main block. To begin with, we'll cock the rifle, then we can just slide the valve housing into the main block, but before that goes in, I am just going to add a small amount of silicone grease to these 2 O-rings here. And with that done, we can slide the valve housing into position. The next thing we'll do is get this little plug screw here installed into this hole in the main block, and to do that up we're going to be using a 3mm Allen key. With that done, we can install the little securing plate, which is this piece here, over these two pieces, making sure everything lines up. Then we can get the 3 screws started. We like to start them all first before doing any one up tight. So the rear one can be done up with a 4mm Allen key, and then the 2 front ones can be done up with a 2.5mm Allen key. Before we do those up tight, we just take a look around the block and make sure the plate is bridging the 2 nicely. Then we can get those done up nice and tightly. With that done, we can then decock the rifle. The next thing we can do is install the cocking indicator, so this little assembly here. To do that, we'll lift up the cocking arm, then install these 2 pieces here, so we have a small shuttle and then a small spring as well. That just goes in the side there. Then we can put the small spring behind it. And I'll just get you a close-up on that so you can see how it's aligned. So you can see those 2 pieces there and how they interact. What we can do then is add the cocking indicator, and this needs to be aligned with the long side towards the back of the rifle. You can push that in the back there. And then as this goes in, you may need to just pull this shuttle back just slightly so that everything lines up. With that done, the last thing we can do is install the cover piece and then get that secured using the 2 countersunk bolts. But there we have it. There's the cocking indicator. And as you can see, it's working on the side there. Now, we'll say that some people have reported the cocking indicator to affect the consistency of the rifle, so you can leave it off if you want to. To be honest with you, in my testing I didn't find any difference. The only thing I will say is that with the cocking indicator installed, sometimes when you pull the cocking arm back, you get to a point where the spring sort of feels like it's bulking out. But again, if you had that problem, you could just remove the cocking indicator entirely. The rifle works fine without it. The next thing I'll do is install my cocking arm. So I'm going to push that through like so and get that done up. This is obviously a custom one. The original one is fairly nice. The last 2 things we can install are the bottle and the shroud. So to begin with, I'll just screw the shroud on. This obviously is my custom shroud. We made it on the channel, so you can see the video of me making this if you're interested in that. But that just screws on nice and easily. The original BSA one is obviously a little different. You have a small collar at the back here, which you need to grub screw onto the barrel, then screw your shroud directly onto that. It's nice and easy to install. The only thing that I will mention is that you have to make sure that you've got a small gap between the block and the back of the shroud. If your shroud's touching the block, you may experience a little bit of accuracy issues. But with that said, we can install the bottle by just screwing it onto the front. And there we have it. There's pretty much the whole rifle reassembled. We're not seeing any leaks at the moment, or any major ones. We will obviously have to leave the rifle overnight with a small mark on the gauge to make sure we haven't got a slow leak, but I can't hear any air hissing out of anywhere. The last thing we can do is get the action installed into the stock. Before we do that though, I am just going to very briefly mention the safety at the back here. Now I'm going to be leaving my safety out for now, as I may have to fine tune the power as we get down range. We've obviously done a full disassembly and then a full rebuild, so the rifle may shift a little on power as we shoot the rifle. So for now I'm going to be leaving my safety off, but to install the safety it's nice and easy. All you would need to do is align it just like so. Then if you take a look at this plastic piece here, this does rotate on the back here, and what you need to do is line the plastic piece up with the holes in the side of the block. So there's one. What you do is push your safety in the back, then install that using the small pins. So you'd push the pins in and then rotate the plastic piece to get to the other hole. So you could do that and that would capture your safety. For now though, I'm going to be leaving mine off. The last thing we'll do is get the action installed into the stock, and to do that we'll just gently line the stock up and push it into position. And we can get our stock bolt installed using a 4mm Allen key. And there we have it. That's pretty much the entire rifle fully rebuilt. And with that said, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.